Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Topic 3, and we're going to be looking at crime trends and tools that are used to measure crime. Your textbook talks about 5 tools for measuring crime: the Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the self-report surveys. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the 2 that are in yellow, the Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey. I'll leave it to you to read about neighbors and self-report surveys. And for all of these, make sure that you look at the factors that affect the validity of these tools for measuring crime. We'll touch on that a little bit in lecture, but I'm relying on you to read in more detail the validity issues in the textbook. The Uniform Crime Report is issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and it's probably the best known and most widely cited source of criminal statistics. We talked about earlier in the semester how crime in criminal justice in the United States is a shared power relationship between the national government and the state and local governments, and the UCR is a good example of that. While the FBI, which is a federal, a part of the federal government, while they issue the reports giving us an idea of how much crime is taking place nationwide, that federal report is based on the monthly reports of local police departments. Over 17,000 local police departments participate in the UCR. And these are the reports are based on the crimes that are reported to local law enforcement departments, and also the number of arrests that these local police agencies have made. The UCR also reports cleared crimes, and when a crime is cleared, it doesn't mean that it's solved. Okay, a lot of students think when a crime is cleared, it means it's solved. That's not what a cleared crime is from the UCR standards. A cleared crime is when law enforcement identify a person that they arrest for the crime, and then they turn that person over to the courts. Okay, and so it's that like basically the transition from the law enforcement stage to the prosecutorial stage. That is what is considered a cleared crime. And not a lot of crimes are cleared in the United States. About 20% of all crimes are cleared. That is, a person is arrested and identified as being the potential perpetrator of this crime. But violent crimes are more likely to be cleared. And so make sure you read in the textbook about how there's a higher clearance rate for violent crimes and the reasons for why that is. Now, there are, as with all reports, there are factors that affect validity. And so when you're thinking about sort of the strengths and weaknesses of all of the tools, we're just going to talk about two. Keep those in mind in terms of thinking about like in what way they do a good job of measuring crime and where they fall short. Probably the biggest problem with the UCR is that the reporting practices. The UCR is based on crimes that are reported to cops. And as we know, not all crimes are reported to the police. According to the National Victim Survey that we'll talk about in a second, less than 40% of crimes are actually reported to the police. And so the UCR kind of gives us an incomplete picture in terms of the amount of crime that is taking place. There's also, they talk about law enforcement practices and methodological issues with the UCR, and the neighbors tool that you're going to be learning about, the National Incident Based Reporting, that does kind of is helping close the loop in terms of some of these methodological and law enforcement practices. The reports are voluntary. Not all local law enforcement participate in it. The reports can vary in accuracy, so make sure you read more about that in the textbook. That there are different ways to interpret crime, and there's not necessarily a standard method that is used. And that when multiple crimes take place, oftentimes only the most serious is recorded, and no federal crimes are reported in the UCR, since it's based on sort of local law enforcement reporting. So these are just some of the methodological or the factors that affect the validity of the Uniform Crime Report. But make sure you read more about that in the textbook. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the UCR is the methods that the UCR uses to express crime data. And it's not just the UCR that expresses crime data in this way. The National Crime Victimization Survey does this too. And so just keep these methods for expressing crime in your mind throughout the course of this semester. And so one thing that when you look at the UCR, we also see this in National Crime Victimization surveys too, but they just will tell you like the raw figure. And the raw figure is the number of actual crimes that are reported to cops, okay? And so that, for example, in 2017, there were 319,000 plus robberies that occurred in that year. And so we know what the raw number is. Now, the raw number doesn't tell us very much. I mean, that could be a lot, right? If, it sounds like a lot, right? But how large is the population of the United States, right? I mean, so if you have 350 plus, 300 plus million people live in the United States, was that a lot, right? And so the raw number alone, like when you say that there were, 90 homicides in Milwaukee last year, well, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is it a lot based on sort of that Milwaukee only has 500,000 people who live in it. So raw figures is one way that they report crime data. Probably a more important way, well, they're both important, they're just figures, right? But the raw figure only gives you limited information. The crime rate bases it on population, and it allows us to compare like a smaller city like Milwaukee with a larger city like New York City. And so you could say, well, how does the crime rate in Milwaukee compare to the crime rate in New York or Los Angeles, et cetera? And that's because it's based on the rate is based on per 100,000 people that live in the city. And so to figure out the crime rate, you take the number of reported crimes and then you divide it by the entire US population if you want to know what the national crime rate is. And then you multiply it by 100,000, okay? And so, for example, that the US robbery rate in 2017 was 98 per 100,000 inhabitants. And so out of 100,000 inhabitants in the United States, 98% of those people were victims, or at least there were 98 robberies reported for every 100,000 inhabitants. Okay. And you can do that crime rate for any locality. So you could take Milwaukee, you'd say the number of reported crimes divided by the population in Milwaukee multiplied by 100,000. And so crime rate does a really good job of being able to compare crime rates from cities to city, state to state, and country to country. And then finally, that the UCR will compute changes. It will tell us whether there's been an increase or decrease over time so that we get a better sense of crime trends. So for example, that when you look at the trend in crime from 2008 to 2017, when it comes to robberies, we've seen a 28% decrease in the robberies in that time. So the UCR, since it is this national reporting device, it does a good job in expressing crime data in multiple ways. Now let's turn our sights to the National Crime Victimization Survey, known as the NCVS. This is also sponsored by a part of the Department of Justice. The FBI is obviously the part of the United States Department of Justice, and so is the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And this tool is really different than the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report is based on reports that police give to the federal government. The National Crime Victimization Survey, keyword there is survey, is based on a nationwide survey of U.S. households. And it's a lot of households. And so there are more than 42,000 households that are included in the National Crime Victimization Study. That's about 78,000 people. It includes people aged 12 and up. And like any good survey, these households are randomly selected and they are representative of what the United States looks like. And so the people who are surveyed should the demographics of that survey sample should be demographically similar to the United States as a whole. Another cool aspect of the National Crime Victimization Survey is that the households stay in the survey for 3 years, and they're interviewed twice a year. So again, you kind of get this sort of like, it's not just like a whole new group of households that are surveyed, that we get to see some consistency year to year, at least worth the 3 years where these households stay in the survey. One of the benefits of, and so the National Crime Victimization Survey is actually asking people, have you been a victim of crime, right? And so then the people say, yes, I have been a victim of crime. And then they'll say, what crime they've been a victim of, whether it was burglary, theft of something in the backyard, car being stolen, rape, aggravated assault. Of course, you can't, include homicides because the person it was a victim of homicide cannot take a survey. But it's based on people reporting out whether they've been a victim. The survey also provides information about the victim's age, sex, race, and also and other things, marital status, income, and also gives us information about the offender, the sex of the offender, race, the approximate age, and whether or not the victim knew the offender. So you get a lot of really interesting data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. We know from the National Crime Victimization Survey that many crimes go unreported to the police, and that's one of the useful tools of the National Crime Victimization Survey, or one of the useful aspects of the survey. As with all tools measuring crime, there are going to be some factors that affect the validity of this tool. And so, what are some of the factors that affect the validity of the National Crime Victimization Survey? Well, one factor is this is a survey, and so that there could be the victim could be, or the person doing the survey could misrepresent what happened to them. They used the example in your textbook that that a person could say that their wallet was stolen, but maybe they misinterpreted that. Maybe their wallet wasn't stolen, but maybe it was lost, but they report it as stolen. So there could be some over-reporting. There can also be under-reporting as well. They do a better job of reporting crimes that don't go reported to police, but there's still going to be some crimes that are not going to be reported even in a survey environment. And that could have to do with sort of the embarrassment of telling a surveyor that you've been raped, or that you've been a victim of spousal abuse, or a 12-year-old, and higher. They probably might feel really embarrassed or scared to say that they had been abused by their parents. So there's always going to be an unreporting aspect of the survey. And as with any survey, it's a survey. Okay, you're not asking every person lives in the United States. We could do that, but it would cost a shit ton of money, and by the time we got the report, it wouldn't be useful anymore. So it's based on a limited number of people. So you have to make sure that the group is representative. That's what's known as a sampling error, and there's always going to be sampling errors in samples. And so the sampling error in the National Crime Victimization Survey is pretty low. It's less than 1%. But still, it still is a sample. And there are other problems with wording of questions, etc. So make sure you read about that in the textbook. Still, most social scientists find the National Crime Victimization Survey to be a very valid tool for measuring crime. And it's one of the largest surveys that we have that's taken in the United States. Okay, so let's turn our sights to comparing the reality of how much crime is taking place in the United States to the perception of how much crime is taking place in the United States. And the tools we just talked about are trying to give us a measure of the reality of how much crime's taking place. But we also conduct surveys to ask people about their perception of crime, whether they think crime is going up, down, or staying the same. So how much crime is taking place in the United States? Well, if you listen to some elected officials, it would be easy to conclude that crime is worse than it's ever been. I think one of the aspects that was troubling to some, but that was attractive to others, was the former President Donald Trump's, focus on just how much crime there was in the United States. His inaugural address after he was elected in 2017 is known as the American Carnage inaugural address. I'm not making that up, because he really just talks about how dangerous the United States is and how under his leadership he's going to stop all the danger. And so, listening, and he's not the only elected official that does that. I mean, you can't go wrong by saying, crime's out of control and I'm here to fix it. That's a technique that's used by many politicians. So it's when you think about elected officials and you watch the media and the amount of media coverage that violent crime gets, it would be easy to conclude that crime is worse than it ever has been. Well, is it? Well, the perception is that the vast majority of Americans believe that crime is either getting worse or staying the same. We're going to take a look at that statistic and a graph that sort of demonstrates that. And while there has been some recent closing of the gap, that there is still a significant gap between perception and reality. The reality is, and as you know from reading in your textbook, is that all types of crime have been on the decline in the United States since 1993. There has been some upticks in 2016 and 2017, but it returned to a normal downward trend. And that you're going to be reading some articles this week. Make sure you read them because there will be quiz questions on them that looks at trends in crimes and how difficult it is to measure trends in crimes sometimes. But that you're also going to be reading about 2020. And what we know about 2020 is that there has been a rise in homicides in 2020. And the question is why? 2020 is such a bizarro year. And so there has been a rise in homicides, but there hasn't been a rise in violent crime. So at this point, criminologists are sort of like, what's going on? And we don't know yet. So, but anyways, the takeaway from this slide is that the perception of how much crime there is out of whack with the reality. So let's take a look at the graph that illustrates that gap. Okay, so this is based on Gallup polls, and every year, and they continue to do the polling now, but this is a nice graph from 2015 that shows this gap between perception and reality. And so every year that the Gallup poll will ask the question about people's perceptions of the crime rate. Do they think that the crime rate is going down? Do they think that the crime rate is staying the same? Or do they think that there's more crime in the United States today than there was a year ago? That's the way they ask the question. The dark green line is showing people's perception, the percentage of people in the United States starting in 1992 that the report that there's more crime in the United States, okay? The light green line is the violent crime victimization rate, okay? And so that's telling you the rate of victimization per 100,000 in the United States for violent crimes. So what you should see there is that until 2000 and really 2001, there wasn't a gap very much. Like that still people thought that there was more crime in the United States than the year before, but it's going down. So while the perception about whether there's more crime is going down, it's matching up with the reality. The reality is that crime continues to go down. But then starting in 2001, then the perception that there's more crime taking place in the United States, it starts going up. But the reality is that how much crime is actually, the rate of crime in the United States continues on a downward trend, thus making a fairly significant gap between perception and reality. So I'm a social scientist, so let's look at some graphs, continue looking at graphs. This is just another way of looking at the crime rate falling. And so here it takes a look at the violent crimes. It looks at the property crimes, okay? And it looks at the trend over time. And you can see that in both of those that there is a significant, so in both violent crime and property crime, we see that there is a decline in crime in the United States. This is another look at like a pretty broad swath of time from the 1960s to 2016, and that is showing you the national violent crime rate. And so it that keeps it kind of in perspective that while our crime rates have gone down in the United States since their high in the 1990s, that we're not back to the rates of crime in the 1960s. Now, in both the textbook and the article, you'll be reading about how it could just be that we have better ways of measuring crime. And so back in the 1960s, we didn't have as good of tools for measuring crime. So it might have seemed like there was less crime, but there's really not less crime. And it just was that we didn't have a tool to measure it. Or it could just simply be that there was less crime. Your textbook and both the articles you're reading are going to be talking about like why we've seen a decrease in crime. It could have to do with the age cohorts, that we have less young people in our society. Young people are more likely to commit crimes, old people less likely to commit crimes. That we have better policing, that there's less lead in our water and in our just bodies in general, and so there's lots of different theories for why we've seen a decrease in crime. But whatever the cause, it is going down. And then one final graph that shows you the homicide, the national homicide rate. Okay. And so again, we see it really peak and then we see it go down and almost down to like 1960 levels. Okay. So as the previous slides show that, starting in 2001, we really see this growing gap between the perception of crime and the reality of crime in the United States. And I used to do this. I haven't done this for a while, but I used to when I used to teach this class on the first day, I would give the survey to my students, and I would ask them on the first day do they think crime is going up, going down, or staying the same? If I'd given that question to you at the beginning of this semester before you'd even cracked open the textbook, how would have you answered that question? Would you have said that crime is going up, staying the same, or would you know that crime was on the decline for the most part in the United States? How would you have responded to that? And if you responded that crime is staying the same or going up, what shapes your either perception or misperception of crime? Is it the media? Is it just the attention that violence gets in movies? Is it just something that you're concerned about? I live in a city, and even though I know that violent crime is on the decline, there's still violent crime in my neighborhood, right? And so it could just be your lived experience as well that shapes your perception of crime. And think about, is this gap a cause for concern? This gap between reality and perception. What potential impact does the perception of crime have on politics and policy in the United States? I think we definitely saw that with the election of President Donald Trump, that if people think there's a lot of crime in the United States, even though they're not, and then they have a president or a lawmaker who is basically saying, I'm here to fix the crime problem, then you're more likely to elect that person because of the misperception that you have. And so there's a link between policies and perception. And if people perceive that crime is out of control, it's pretty hard to pass policy that's saying, you know what, we really should change our policing practices, or that we don't need to spend so much money on law enforcement because crime is actually on the decline. Just something to think about in terms of that relationship between perception and policy. But what about 2020? So here we are talking about crime is on the decline, but 2020 has been a weird ass year, as we all know, mostly due to the pandemic. And as any social scientist knows, that you really cannot draw conclusions from outliers. And 2020 is a huge outlier year. That because of the pandemic, it's had a real grave impact on the economy. People are staying in their houses, their mental health is being affected. It's an outlier year. So we don't want to draw a lot of conclusions or make any, sort of connections with what's going on with 2000. as I said, we have seen a significant uptick in homicides, and you're going to be reading that about in your articles. But there's not been an increase in violent crime rates, and that's weird. Usually, violent crime and homicide rates usually when one goes up, the other goes up. So it's weird that homicides are going up, but violent crime rates don't seem to be going up. And your articles that you're going to be reading are going to be exploring why that is and other aspects of that. So make sure that you read the two articles that dig into this issue more deeply. There will be quiz questions on it. One is a more general article from the New Yorker called The Trouble with Crime Statistics. And so it actually just sort of complicates the whole, like, difficult. It shows how difficult it is to sort of like figure out trends in crimes and even tools used to measure crimes. So read it because it's going to make you think even more critically about the tools you're learning about in your textbook. And then we're reading a Vox article called The Rise in Murders in U.S. Explained. That's what Vox does. It does have a liberal twist. So, you can look at the liberal sort of policy, prescriptions at the end of the article, but that doesn't mean that while their prescriptions may be biased, their explanations for the crime and their demonstration of the rise in crime rates, that's something that is not affected by their sort of liberal policy prescriptions. So take a look at both of those articles and make sure that you're prepared for the quiz. And thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. And happy Mardi Gras.